Welcome to the Passing Through Podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments, the silence that stitches a song together. This isn't a podcast about answers or about fixing the world. It's a space for listening, for slowing down and sitting in the unknown to see what might surface in the stillness. Season's greetings to you, dear listeners. I am not going to do a Christmas episode this year. I did one last year, but that was just because I had the time. This year, I don't foresee that I will. And I figured that I would go non-denominational this time and focus in instead on the winter solstice. Because wherever you are, actually, as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that's not true because it's only if you're in the northern hemisphere. So if you're in the southern hemisphere, I guess this doesn't apply to you. But if you are in that 50% of the earth that is in the northern hemisphere, then we are fast approaching the winter solstice. And I aim to have this episode pushed out on that day so that you can have something to listen to on this most sacred of days. Because what I was going to say is that people, for time immemorial, people before recorded history, we have been celebrating the solstice across time and culture for as long as there have been humans, probably. And I want to dig into that and try and think about why that might be and what this signifies. What is it that we're doing as extensions of the earth? What is the earth doing? What is this process? What are these cycles that we call the seasons? I would guess that wherever you are, whether it's in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, when winter comes around for you, that probably means certain things. And it's probably always meant certain things up until very recently. Because in recent times, in our modern era, we have severed ourselves from these cyclical, spiral kind of fractalizing patterns of nature. Now we have heating systems and air conditioners, and we can just get on a plane and go on holiday to a warmer climate. We have found a way to avoid dealing with these things. Any kind of discomfort or hardship or struggle, we have sought to minimize and extricate ourselves from. But up until recently, for all of human history, winter meant scarcity, hunger, and potentially death. Winter is that time of letting go, of shedding, of release, of decay and darkness, where nature decomposes and empties, trying to make space for something else. And anyone who spent time with the land, gardeners, farmers, foresters, they can tell you that for something new to emerge, something has to die and become compost to feed and fertilize the soil and provide the necessary nutrients and conditions for life to take hold. This process of birth and death are interrelated. It's a fundamental component of the continuous life cycle that we are part of. So winter happens in this larger cycle. And back to the question, what is winter? What is nature doing during winter? If we were to try to feel that somatically, not intellectually, but if we use our experience. We think back to our memories as children playing in the snow, watching the animals. We think to later experiences, maybe hiking in the winter. Maybe you had the opportunity to settle down somewhere in the winter. Or maybe you had the misfortune of being homeless during a winter and having to survive on the streets. But what is the world doing in winter? What are the trees doing? Is there something that nature can teach us about this part of the cycle? Most of the trees let go of their leaves in a sort of offering to the ground, giving their leaves as mulch so that the earth can feed on them and life can spring into existence in the coming year. It's in the fucking name, right? And, actually, I want to make an aside here and talk about my language, because in interviews, I tend to keep my language civil, but when it's just me, I can be as crude as I want to be. I'll say, fuck and shit and piss and balls and dicks and ass and anus. I guess anus isn't a curse, but motherfucker and scallywag. In terms of language, I try to be an equal opportunity employer, giving life to the saintly and sacred, as well as the sordid and sullied. And what better time to get in touch with the muck than in the winter? Speaking of muck, actually, this morning, as I was trudging through frozen patches of mud where wild boar had torn up a field in the night, and when I say wild boar, I don't mean that there were just a couple of wild boar having a party in a field. There must have been an entire fucking drove of them. Swine everywhere. And I Googled it because I wasn't sure what you call a big group of boar. And I kid you not, it's called a singular. A mixed group of pigs led by a matriarch is called a sounder. And so next time you find yourself needing to describe a group of feral pigs, now you know what they're called. And when I walk the dogs through the fields of the surrounding hills in the mornings, as I see these frosty patches of earth and dirt, when I walk over them, I notice that they are hard and crunchy and icy under my feet. And it's a strange feeling, because typically when I see dirt, I anticipate it to be soft and sort of warm, as though the morning sunlight would have softened the earth somehow. And to find it frozen kind of thwarts my expectations of what earth should feel like. And to go back to my point here, the winter is doing something. Something elemental is happening. Even the water in the surface of the soil seems to freeze and harden. Before, when I was talking about the trees and what they do, I was thinking that the trees are actually shedding their leaves to surrender them and offer them as mulch. Yes, in a show of reciprocity and grace and gifting something to the earth. But also, one of the reasons that they're shedding those leaves and they're letting go is because the earth is tilted away from the sun. And so when the light goes through the atmosphere, it becomes more diffuse. It spreads out. It doesn't have that same kind of penetrating power. And the air isn't as warm. The soil isn't as warm. And I guess the leaves, I don't know this is just a hypothesis, don't photosynthesize as well. And so they can let go of those leaves and they can give them as an offering and keep that cycle going. And when they do that, this provides a little blanket on top of the earth. This provides a place for moisture to gather, for fungi to come and break these things down and help them decompose. And this whole spirit of interrelated reciprocity and gifting just starts to become more apparent and more obvious. So to get back to these cycles, and back to winter, what I realized the other day is that ultimately what we are doing is passing through larger natural cycles. And we are cycles. So we're cycles passing through cycles. It's fractal. Our bodies are part of a larger ecological body. Our skin has grasses growing up through it. We have rivers of blood and chemicals coursing through us. We are moving bodies of flesh and bone and water in a process of growth and decay that started long before we were born and will end long after we're dead. But how do things grow? Anything that's growing is growing by feasting on the life that came before it. Everything that lives does so on the bones of the dead. Life consumes life. But in wintertime, it seems like there's less of it around to consume. Some cultures call the winter the hungry times. In Algonquin-speaking First Nations traditions of North America, this is when the Wedigo roams the land. Insatiable, hungering, greedy, and longing to consume. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Wedigo is a monstrous, cannibalistic spirit, a bit like a zombie and a vampire. If you were bitten by the Wedigo, you would become one. And it can generally be viewed as a cautionary tale, a cultural technology to safeguard against gluttony and selfishness at a time when conditions are harsh and food is scarce. So this speaks a bit to what winter is doing, right? It's peeling away. It's slowing down, sort of freezing. Those rivers and streams and creeks that were flowing come to a trickle. They freeze over. Things become still. There's this sense of death and decomposition, darkness. But winter isn't just a time for stillness, freezing, shedding. It's also a time to go inward and to lean into a kind of spiritual collapse and letting go. So there's this question that's been in my head, and it sounds like, what does letting go of your leaves look like? And I'm not sure, actually. I think I'm always in a process of letting go of expectations, letting go of old fears, letting go of what I should do, letting go of my job, letting go of a comfortable home. You know, I've been in a process of letting go of a lot of things. And in a way, that's a kind of collapse, right? You could see that as an inward collapse, a way of shedding the leaves of modernity. But what I've been curious about, what I've been wondering is whether some of those leaves might not be suitable as mulch or fertilizer. Whether some of those leaves might be plastic or coated in toxic chemicals, forever chemicals, radioactive chemicals, things that on a geological time frame, sure, will decompose and will be assimilated into that larger Earth cycle, but in the short term, may be a bit more persistent. And maybe that's okay because some things eat plastic. You know, oyster mushrooms through bioremediation can consume plastic and break it down, for example. So I've been trying to uncover what those things are inside of me that are resistant to being composted. Those things that refuse to be decomposed. And I guess that brings another point into focus, which is that not everything inside of us needs to be processed, decomposed, and broken down within a single human life, right? We often, there's this misconception in modern discourse, modern sensibilities about the self, due to these ideas of human exceptionalism, our sense of separation from nature, colonialism, conquest, scientific materialism, control, predatory capitalism. All of these things condition us to think that we own things, that we are the pinnacle of evolution, that we are in control of this show. You know, these are things that couldn't be further from the fucking truth when you think about it. These are things that are insane distortions of the truth. So yeah, my point about all of that is just to remind us that sometimes there may be things that will take longer than a human life to break down. Some of the damage that we're doing right now to our planet, even if we halted everything, if we snapped our fingers and there was a magic wand that somehow made it possible to replace our energy systems with something fully sustainable and renewable, the harm that we've done would still take millennia to heal. And so, speaking of time, I wanted to talk a little bit about fire. Fire is something that predates the emergence of humans on the scene, right? These elemental ancestors of ours, water, fire, wind, earth, these things have been here since the beginning. Humans came along and they found a way to harness fire. And I wonder what things were like before we figured that out. What winter might have been like without fire. Without something to cook our food, keep us warm, light up the dark. What was that like in those primal times of this cycle? You know, because our experience of winter is so different than the human experience of winter for most of the time we've been on this planet. You know, humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years, anatomically modern humans, and electricity is a relatively recent invention. I don't know how long ago we figured out how to use fire, but in my experience, my apprenticeship with fire, which I would say has been a lifelong apprenticeship, but really became more important since I've been on the farm here in Poland, where our heating comes from a wood stove. So when I'm out there collecting the chopped wood, or when it's a sunny day and I have some energy and I feel like chopping some wood, I start to develop a dialogue with that wood. Because what is wood? It's just the earth. It is an elemental force of the earth manifest in wood, in layers of bark and carbon, right? And so when I'm out there collecting the wood, I feel a connection to it. I feel an appreciation. I feel a gratitude because I know that that wood is going to keep us warm. That wood is going to let us cook our tea, heat our food. It's going to give us light. It's going to give us comfort. It's going to make life very, very enjoyable and very pleasant. Because instead of shivering in the dark, eating cold food, taking cold showers, all of which would be possible. And our ancestors did that for a long, long time. But we have become so acculturated to an obscene, luxurious, ludicrous level of comfort that we forget what a joy, what a gift what an incredible thing fire is. And for most of my life, I somehow thought that, or the language that I would use about fire was that I was starting a fire. And you've probably heard many people say that. Maybe you still say that. Maybe you still perceive fire as something that you are doing. But what I've come to learn is that fire is a collaborative act, and it needs to be carried out through relationship, through the relationship of a spark, the earth in the form of wood, wind, and my attention. Because one thing I noticed is if I'm starting a fire and I look away or I get up to do something else thinking that that fire has what it needs to thrive and flourish, often the fire goes out. And I have to listen to the fire. I have to be with the fire. I have to see if I could feel what the fire needs and feed it for the flames to grow. It's that cycle of growth again, right? It's there in the micro and it's there in the macro. It's fractal. So fire, I've come to learn, can only exist through partnership between these elemental forces, and it needs to be blessed by them. I find that if I take the fire for granted, if I don't honor it, if I don't look at it, if I don't blow on it, if I don't talk with it, if I don't try to meticulously craft the optimal structure for the fire to move through, it won't take, right? A fire in its early state is a very delicate thing. That's what I've come to learn in movies and popular culture. There's this concept that fire is this really easy thing. You know, all you need is a spark and you're going to burn your house down. And that might be true if that spark happens to land on a dry stack of newspapers in the corner of your home. Yeah, maybe. In a well-ventilated corner of your home where there's enough oxygen, airflow, and fuel for the fire to spread out on. But what I've noticed is that a fire in that state can be easily crushed, suffocated, extinguished, starved. And so it's this paradoxical thing, right? But the thing that stood out the most to me is that fire breathes and moves and speaks. You know, not just in the hisses and pops and cracks and sizzling sounds that come out of the fire, but if you really listen to it, there's something that it's saying. And I don't mean this in some woo-woo mystical thing where I can speak with fire. That's not what I mean. I mean it in the sense of, you know, fire isn't saying words to me. It's not telling me to go buy the new Taylor Swift album. It's, you know, it might be telling me that it needs more air. It needs more fuel. It wants some birch. The bark of birch is an incredible fuel for fire. I never knew this. I didn't understand why there were sheets of birch beside my stove in the cabin that we were staying in until I started to make a fire, and I saw how magical and beautiful the relationship between fire and birch bark is. Birch bark burns better than any material I've ever seen. It's as though it were made for fire. It is one of the most incredible kindlings, and it can save a fire that's on the brink of death. I've brought back many a fire just by adding a little piece of birch in the right place. And that's the other thing about fire is the topography of fire, learning where the next piece of wood should be placed and whether or not the fire needs to be moved a little bit. And these are the things that it can speak to you if you're listening and you're watching and you're seeing how it's dancing and moving and breathing. And this kind of intimacy with fire I never had before. And so this is new. And every time I'm collecting wood or chopping wood or feeding wood into the stove, I am feeling thankful and grateful. And I'm honoring the spirit of that wood because it's turning into fire. It is being eaten by the fire. And when it's eaten by the fire, it becomes the fire. That's another interesting thing, staring into the fire as it claims the wood. Where does the wood end and the fire begin? It becomes this really interesting symbiosis, this strange dance, this fusion, this weird thing when you're staring into the fire. You know, it could also be the smoke inhalation when the cabin got a little too smoky when I had started a fire and I was hearing the fire speak to me and watching it dance and watching the wood become the flames and the flames become the wood. Maybe it was due to smoke inhalation that I was having these kind of altered states of consciousness watching the fire, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe this is just how fire is if you open yourself up to dialogue with it. And fire was also teaching me other things. It was teaching me about balance, because only the right balance of elements sustained stably over time will allow the fire to take hold. Right? It's very delicate. Once the fire becomes healthy and it's spread and it's even and it has a different sound, it has a more mature sound. You know, the young fire almost has a kind of infantile cry to it. If I were describing it, there is something nascent about it, something immature and young and hungry. And it hits a point where it isn't anymore, and it's steady and it's strong. And then as that cycle continues and it gets closer to the end of its cycle, it again gets weak. It seems to grow pale, smokier. The embers are glowing and they're kind of breathing in this thin, raspy way. And it's beautiful. The whole process is beautiful and interesting, but balance is one thing it taught me. Respect, gratitude. And I mentioned before how all of this happens through relationship. But another thing about it is that it teaches community. And you might be wondering how. How does fire teach community? Well, each member of its community of flames matters. What I found is that the small pieces can be your most cherished pieces. It is hard to start a fire without small pieces of kindling and thin pieces of wood. But without the larger pieces, the fire will deplete itself too quickly. And so again, it speaks of balance. It speaks of all of the pieces having their function, all of them being necessary, and knowing what the fire needs and when. And so dancing with the fire has been an interesting thing for me this winter. And fire, coincidentally, to take us back to the solstice, is an essential part of many ancient solstice traditions the world over, from ancient Egypt to pre-Christian Druids in what is today called Ireland, to Asia, the Americas, India, Iran, and Albania. And so I want to pause here and say that I am not a historian of the solstice. I am not a solstice scholar. I know barely anything about the solstice. All I know is that I have been alive for nearly 40 of them. This will be the 39th. For most of them, I didn't pay attention. You know, I wasn't so connected to what was happening. I wasn't so aware. But for the ones that I have been paying attention to, which is only the last handful of them, I've noticed certain things. So I want to take a minute to just say a few things about the solstice, which you could probably learn from a quick Wikipedia search, but I can save you the trouble, and you can just hear me talk about it while you make pizza or make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or cook dinner or drive to work or whatever it is that you're doing. I wanted to say something lewd and inappropriate, but I will save that for later. The winter solstice is the day with the shortest period of daylight and the longest night of the year. This is the reverse of the summer solstice, where you have the longest period of daylight and the shortest night of the year. And depending on where you are on the planet, which hemisphere you're in, when the winter solstice is happening in the northern hemisphere, the summer solstice is happening in the southern. So there's again this balance. There's this equal portion of light and dark when looking at the earth from afar, when looking at it from a polar perspective. And on this day, which is going to be December 21st this year, which should be the day that you're listening to this episode, the sun is at its lowest daily maximum elevation in the sky. And the literal translation of solstice is the sun standing still. Paradoxically, this darkest night, this darkness signifies the coming of longer days, right? Because from here on out, every day is going to get a little bit longer, right? They say it's always darkest before the dawn. And that seems to be true here, where on this night with the longest darkness, each subsequent day after the solstice, the days get a little bit longer, a little bit brighter. And ancient peoples were aware of this, right? This was an important day because it marked the kind of rebirth of the sun. It both, again, paradoxically, the rebirth and the death of the sun, because this cycle is ending. This is the end of the year. This is the end of the longest dark, where now the sun is returning. It's coming back away from that faraway tilt. You know, we are moving into warmer days. The sun is coming back. There can be harvests. There can be food. There can be abundance. Spring will come. Summer will come. And so this was a special day. And structures were erected to commemorate this, as monuments to this, to show how important this was. If you go back to ancient Egypt, there were temples that were built to be aligned with the winter solstice sunrise, where people would come together, they would congregate and have feasts and rituals and ceremonies to honor this day, to pay tribute. If you look at other structures like Stonehenge in England or Newgrange in Ireland, these are also associated with the winter solstice. You see it in Germanic cultures. You see it in the Hopi people in what's today called the United States, held the Soyal, also called the Soyaluna or Soyaluna Gual. Sorry for my pronunciation there, but it means establishing life anew for all the world. And for the Hopi people, this ceremony was one of their most important rites of the year. It was a pivotal event, and the purpose of it was to ensure the sun's return and to ensure the renewal of life. So it marked the beginning of their new year and the start of the Katsina season. And Katsinas were guardian spirits that would bring health and bounty and well-being for the entire community. And so this ritual enactment of this moment, this ceremony that they went through, was designed literally to convince the sun to turn back toward the earth from its furthest point and bring its light and bring its warmth and come for the coming year. This is a massively important thing. Imagine if that didn't happen. All life, I would suspect that all life on this planet would be dead. Maybe some things would survive, but the temperatures would drop precipitously. I can't even imagine what would happen. Like, to think of how vital the sun is, just try to imagine that for a moment. Imagine if the sun just kept drifting away from the earth and it didn't come back to its normal rhythm. What would happen? It would be catastrophic. It would be cataclysmic. It would be a life-ending event, I would think. And so this moment, this solstice moment, was treated with such seriousness and such sacredness. It was so important, on top of all of the hunger, all of the scarcity, all of the fear, the literal death. You know, people would be dying. There wouldn't be enough food. If you were unlucky enough to have a child and there wasn't enough food to go around, Maybe you're going to lose your child and your partner. These were serious things. This wasn't like, let's go drive out to the grocery store and get some things. I hope the snow plows have come through and cleared the roads. This was like the real fucking deal, you know? Like, we don't even have a concept of what that's like anymore. And so people across the world, across time, had these rituals and ceremonies where they would use their bodies, they would use their voices, their songs, their dances, and their stories to honor these energies, to honor these celestial bodies, these spirits, to bring good fortune to their communities, to sing respects and praises, and literally convince the sun to return. That is a beautiful image, and I wish that there was more of that in our world, that kind of reverence and sacredness and connection and relationship, right? Because it's understood that we are dependent on these forces and we don't control them. And they're not guaranteed, right? Nothing is guaranteed. Just because the sun happens to have followed this orbit over time doesn't mean it will continue to do so, right? The magnetic poles of the earth switch periodically. So if you were born into some generations where it was a given that the poles were always this way, and then they flipped, this would be pretty horrifying, right? This would upend your world. Not necessarily because it would have any impact on you, but just because something that seemed to be a natural law or a given, some kind of steady, unchanging thing changed. That's a lesson from the universe. Again, that's what these cycles teach us. Things are always in a state of flux and change. And just because something is one way one day doesn't mean it will be so again. And I understand that it's more complex than that, right? Because these cycles, by virtue of them being cyclical, do imply that things are happening in similar ways to the ways that they've always been happening. That's what a cycle is, right? It's this kind of spiraling thing. So there's paradox in it, of course, right? The cycle doesn't preclude the possibility of change. So yeah, these are the types of things that I've been thinking about as we move into this solstice. And I'll come back to the question again, what is the earth doing at this time? What is nature doing at this time? What is it inviting us to do? How can we shed what isn't serving us? How can we compost things that may be harmful? How can we embrace that darkness while simultaneously honoring and inviting the sun to return? How can we hold those two seemingly opposite, polarized ideas at once? The earth does that, right? Look at the earth. The earth has two poles where the solstices are happening simultaneously, the polar opposite of each other. One with a lengthy spell of darkness and one with a lengthy spell of light. So we have this paradox, we have this complexity, we have this strangeness within us because we see it in the cosmos. Right? Because that's another thing to think about. We are earthbound creatures. We are of this earth, we are born of this earth, but the earth itself is held in a larger container, in a larger set of relationships that we call the universe. And the things that are happening on earth are happening because of what's happening outside of the earth in the larger context of a universe. The way that the sun is moving around in our solar system, where our galaxy is in relationship to the larger cosmic landscape. If a black hole suddenly opened up, we're done. So we are at the mercy of these cosmic forces. Even think about people getting skin cancer. little radioactive photons get emitted. I don't know if they're radioactive. It sounds like they should be. I'm not sure what the definition of radioactive in this case is, but I would think that the sun's rays are radioactive because they swim through space and collide with your skin and mutate the cells there. That sounds pretty radioactive to me, but I'm not a scientist, so don't quote me on that. But a cosmic force can deeply impact your life here on this planet. And that's just one thing out there. That's the sun, right? The moon is moving around us. It's like a little shield protecting us. Asteroids are hitting it. It's cratered with all of the impacts that it's had over the time that it's existed. Think about all of the damage that the moon has absorbed to protect life on this planet. Think about how it impacts the tides, how it lights up the night skies, how its darkness lets us see that sea of stars twinkling in the sky, in this vast ocean of space, stars shooting by. The moon is another symbol of constantly being in change, in flux. And yes, again, it happens cyclically. There's actually a story that I think I heard Michael Meade tell about the moon that stuck with me, where there's some ancient story of people debating which celestial body is more powerful, the sun or the moon. And you might imagine someone to say that, well, of course it's the sun, because we are a post-enlightenment culture, right? Whatever that means. Where we really prefer the light. We like things to be luminous and gilded. We feel safety in the light. The darkness still frightens us, right? So it isn't a surprise that the sun would be seen as a more powerful celestial spirit. But the takeaway was that these ancient peoples said that the moon was in fact the stronger or the more mysterious or more powerful. I forget which word it was. Because the moon changes. The sun always comes up and goes down in the same way. But sometimes the moon is half a moon. Sometimes the moon is a crescent moon. Sometimes the moon is full, and sometimes the moon isn't even there at all. And this capacity for change, to be reborn out of death, right? It's renewing itself. It's coming from nothing and growing and then shrinking back to nothing. It's kind of breathing, right? And its visibility is a kind of breath cycle. And so all around us, I think in winter, nature invites us to contemplate with all of our being, right? Not an intellectual contemplation, but a contemplation that is a full spectrum contemplation, contemplating with the body, contemplating with the mind, with the soul, with the spirit of what's happening around us. This is what people have done for as long as there have been people. And so I think it's inviting us to do the same. It's inviting us to look inside. It's inviting us not just to look around, but to look inside. As without, so within. As within, so without. As above, so below. So that would be my recommendation for this solstice. Use your awareness, use your intentionality, find a way to honor the season, honor the sun, honor the moon. But this is the sun's time, I would say. So maybe focus your attention on the sun. Think about what the sun does for you. Think about how the sun moves through space and dances with the earth, and what this means for your life, because your life is shaped by these movements. Your body is literally shaped into postures, hunched shoulders with your shoulders up to your ears, shivering with teeth chattering in the winter is happening because of the sun's movement. The sweat seeping out from your pores, the lassitude, the slowness, the sloth and laziness that might come in the oppressive heat of a harsh summer is having your body lie prostrate in a pool of its own sweat and stink and grease and ooze, ear cheese, toe cheese. You're just simmering, you're baking slowly in a fetid, rank aroma of shit and decomposition. That's because of the sun. Isn't that beautiful? Like all of, the times that you go to sleep, the times that you wake up are all modulated by the sun. You are in this dance with these forces, whether or not you realize it. So check in on how you're feeling somatically. Check in what impact this is having on you. And yeah, I think that's it for this solstice rant. I'm trying to think of how to conclude this talk. I mean, of course, part of me wants to have some kind of ritual sacrifice joke in relationship to the solstice here. But that's not coming to me easily. So I'm going to let that one go. I'm going to sacrifice that joke. But yeah, be good to one another. I've expanded the be good to one another to not just our human brothers and sisters, but to all of Earth's creatures. And I would expand that even further now that we've been talking about this cosmic sense of self, our universal body, our galactic body. I mean, I guess galactic is limited to this galaxy. We're going out further to everything, So be good to all of those forces. And I'll be back next time. Okay, I'm back. Sooner than I expected to be speaking to you again, but I had to share something. After I recorded this episode, I was still curious about our relationship with fire. And in this talk, I said something like, I don't know, I wonder what it was like for humans before we had fire to help us through the winter, something like this. So I did a little bit of digging to ask this question to our online overlords. So I went into Google and I put the same question to Google. And what it told me was kind of interesting. Researchers break down our history with fire into 3 different categories. They talk about opportunistic fire use, controlled fire use, and actually making fire. As far as opportunistic fire use goes, they estimate that this was between 1.7 and 2 million years ago, based on archaeological findings of finding soot and wood embers. And the way that this worked, they imagine, was that we were retrieving embers opportunistically. So there might be a brush fire or a wildfire, or maybe lightning struck a tree in a forest and there was a fire. And humans would go and they would take the embers, bring them back to a cave, and try to stoke the flame and keep it going and use it for as long as they could. So this is an interesting idea to think about what we were doing back then with fire before we learned that we could coax it into existence ourselves. And then when you keep thinking about it and you say, okay, so we were doing this opportunistically for a while, and then what? We don't have the full picture, but they think at least as early as 790,000 years ago, we started having controlled fires because they found these in what's today called the Golan Heights in occupied Syrian territory. Some scholars say that the controlled use of fire may have even started as early as 1.8 million years ago. So that would put it back along with the opportunistic use of fire. So you could see that there isn't a lot of agreement on how we were using fire and when. These things are overlapping. Those are pretty big jumps. The difference between 790,000 and 1.8 million is quite a difference. And then if we move into more recent time, and I say recent here, we're talking about 400,000 years ago, they found a Neanderthal site in England. And at that site, there was burnt soil, There were fire-cracked flint hand axes and a couple of fragments of iron pyrite, which the Neanderthals used to strike sparks with flint. So we know that at least at 400,000 years ago, we have evidence that people were using these tools to make fire. And I didn't know that there was such a robust discussion about the impact of fire on our human story, but of course there would be. And if you go to the Wikipedia page article, you'll see a bunch of interesting information there about how fire potentially shaped more complex social cultures because we were around the fire, safe from predators, and we had time to be together. So we were sitting there, and things like language may have emerged because we had this extra time together. We were up later because we weren't sleeping. I guess typically when it would be dark before fire, you would go to bed. But if you have the fire and you could stay up and you can be warm and your crush is sitting there at the fire, now you have an opportunity to sit there and mingle and try to say something witty or funny or impressive or wrestle down in the mud with the other men to show your strength or dominance or whatever the way that you would court a woman back then was. You now have the opportunity to do this stuff by the fire. And this is why I guess some scholars suggest that fire was the thing that allowed humans to develop language. I mean, that's just conjecture. That's just an idea, but it's kind of interesting to think about because it is expanding the window in which we would have interactions, and maybe song emerges, maybe dance. So you could imagine it's a fertile soil. It's a rich ground for having those kind of cultural dynamics emerge. And to perhaps share a less controversial observation, our relationship with fire allowed us to venture out of tropical climates into previously uninhabitable landscapes, which would have been too cold without it. So yeah, our relationship with fire goes way back. It goes back quite a while. And as one of our most important ancestors, it's had a profound impact on our story, from migrations to social dynamics to protection from predators and winter temperatures to tool making, because now we could heat stones and later metals, to art, because now we can craft ceramics and these kind of things. You've probably been to museums where you've seen these ancient vases and things like that. Even our dietary habits, because now we could cook meat, now we could smoke meat and store it longer. So winters get a little bit easier if you're able to hunt and store that meat and make it last. And our nighttime behaviors, these courtship behaviors I was talking about, or these opportunities for play and song and dance and story and all of these things. Of course, that was possible during the day too, but now when you have a place where everyone is aggregating, a space that's inviting the communal to emerge, where everyone's sitting in a circle around the fire, you have that sacred shape take place there. So it's kind of compelling. It's a provocative idea that fire played a vital role in the emergence of a lot of things that we take for granted today. So yeah, pretty fascinating stuff. And I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about that. So sorry for the intrusion at the end of your podcast here. I know I am disrupting the flow a bit. You were looking forward to moving on with your day, and now I'm back here talking about fire, and you just want to go take a shit, or I'm not sure what you want to do, but you're free now. Thank you for your attention. You can now resume these regular.
That looks like the fire pit down there.
I see you've come. And where is the offering?
Yeah, yeah, we got it. You said you wanted a bunch of boar, so we brought you a singular.
You've brought me a single boar. I am fire. I demand
No,
more.
no, that's what I'm saying. We brought a bunch of boar. We got a whole singular for you.
What are you not understanding? I want
Uh,
more. In fact,
well, that
I want
that sounds nice and all, I guess. But I got a kids. I got a wife. I got all these boy here that I brought for
you.
you.
Come on
I wasn't planning on being a ritual sacrifice tonight. You know.
How dare you question me? Proceed to the pit. I hunger.
I don't. I don't think I'm gonna be such a. Maybe next time. I'll do it. I'll do it next time.
I'm
Okay.
tired of this scheme.
Jeez. Oh God. Oh, my anus. Oh, mine's so dead. Oh my God. Oh, my testicles. Oh God. Oh.